On a warm, sunny afternoon, Tasha, a black mother, and her young adopted son, Ethan, were enjoying a peaceful walk through their neighborhood park. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the air was filled with the sounds of children laughing and birds singing. It was one of those perfect moments when everything felt calm and right. Ethan, only 5 years old, skipped ahead of his mother, laughing as he ran towards the playground. Tasha smiled, her heart swelling with love for the little boy who had become the center of her world. Ethan had been with her since he was a baby, and though they were different in many ways, their bond was as strong as any mother and child could be. She had always dreamed of becoming a mother, and when she finally adopted Ethan, it felt like her dream had come true. There was no doubt in her mind that this was her son, and nothing could change that. They continued walking hand in hand, chatting about the little things that made up their day. Ethan told her about his latest favorite superhero, a topic that seemed to change every week, but Tasha didn't mind. She loved hearing his excitement, even if it was about something as simple as a new comic book character. As they made their way down the park's path, they passed by a group of families enjoying the day. Some were sitting on picnic blankets, while others played games with their children. Tasha noticed them, but she wasn't focused on the other families. She was focused on Ethan, making sure he stayed close by. She had learned over the years to be vigilant, always keeping an eye on him, especially in public spaces. But then something strange caught her attention. A woman, standing a few yards away, was watching them intently. Tasha noticed the way the woman's eyes followed them, and how she seemed to be sizing them up. It made her feel uncomfortable, though she didn't know why at first. Tasha quickly turned her attention back to Ethan, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's gaze was not as friendly as it should have been. The woman's look was a mixture of confusion and suspicion, and it made Tasha uneasy. There were no other signs of concern, no one else staring at them, but this woman's eyes never left them. Tasha tried to push the feeling aside, telling herself that maybe she was just being paranoid. After all, it was a busy park, and people watched each other all the time. Maybe the woman had just noticed how Ethan was skipping along and was admiring his energy. But then the woman stepped forward. She walked a little closer to them, her eyes still locked on them, and Tasha felt a chill run through her. She couldn't explain it, but something about the way the woman was acting felt wrong. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something else. Maybe it was the way the woman's gaze flicked between Tasha and Ethan, or the way she shifted uncomfortably, but Tasha knew something wasn't right. She decided to keep walking, hoping the woman would lose interest and go back to whatever she was doing. Ethan, oblivious to the tension in the air, kept chattering away, his little voice bringing Tasha a small sense of calm amidst her growing unease. She just wanted to finish the walk and get back to their quiet home, away from whatever strange feeling the woman was giving her. Little did she know, this walk was about to take an unexpected turn, and their peaceful day in the park was about to be interrupted in a way that neither she nor Ethan could have ever imagined. As Tasha and Ethan continued their walk, the uneasy feeling in Tasha's stomach only grew stronger. She glanced over her shoulder, and there she was again, the woman, still watching them from a distance. This time, the woman wasn't just standing there, though. She had taken out her phone and seemed to be typing something, her eyes never leaving Tasha and Ethan. Tasha tried to ignore it, focusing on Ethan, who was talking excitedly about his favorite superhero. But it was hard to shake the feeling that something was off. Why was this woman still staring at them? What could she possibly be thinking? Tasha couldn't help but wonder. She had walked through this park many times with Ethan, and though people sometimes glanced at them, no one had ever seemed to take such an intense interest before. It was the kind of attention that made her feel like she was doing something wrong when she knew, deep down, that she wasn't. Ethan, oblivious to his mother's growing discomfort, tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, let's go to the swings," he said, his face lighting up with excitement. Tasha smiled, trying to push aside the nagging feeling in her mind. "Sure, sweetie. Let's go play," she replied, squeezing his hand. but her steps were a little quicker now, as if she could outrun the tension in the air. They made their way over to the swings, but as they approached, Tasha couldn't help but notice that the woman had moved closer. She was now standing near the entrance of the playground, still watching them, her phone pointed in their direction. The feeling of unease in Tasha's chest began to grow heavier. She had no idea what this woman wanted, but she couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. Suddenly, Tasha heard a faint sound, a voice. The woman had spoken to someone, though Tasha couldn't make out the words. It wasn't until the woman turned and started walking toward the park entrance that Tasha realized the woman had done something she hadn't expected. She had pulled out her phone again and appeared to be calling someone. A chill ran down Tasha's spine. The woman's actions made Tasha feel exposed, like she was being scrutinized for something she had done wrong. Was the woman calling the authorities? Why would she be calling anyone about a simple walk in the park? And what did she think was going on? Tasha's thoughts raced as she tried to push the worry aside. But she couldn't. The woman's strange behavior had set off alarm bells in her mind. She shook her head, telling herself that it was probably nothing, just an overactive imagination. She and Ethan were just another pair enjoying a day in the park, right? But that uneasy feeling refused to leave her, and the woman's gaze stayed with her, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Tasha turned back to Ethan, who was now swinging high on the playground equipment, his laughter filling the air. She tried to focus on him, telling herself that this was a small moment, just a simple afternoon with her son. But as she glanced back over to the woman near the entrance, she saw that the woman had walked off toward the park's edge and was still looking over her shoulder. The weight of her gaze lingered on Tasha, and a sense of dread swept over her. What was going to happen next? Tasha tried to push the feeling of unease from her mind, but it wasn't easy. She watched as Ethan swung higher and higher, laughing with pure joy. It should have been a peaceful moment, the kind she cherished. But as the seconds ticked by, she couldn't ignore the knot in her stomach. The woman was still nearby, standing near the entrance of the park with her phone in hand. Tasha kept her eye on her, wondering what was going on in her mind. As Tasha kept her distance, the woman seemed to get more agitated. She was pacing back and forth, occasionally glancing in Tasha's direction. The park, which had felt so warm and welcoming just moments before, now felt strange and foreign. Tasha, though she tried to remain calm, found herself constantly glancing around. Her thoughts were clouded by what the woman might be doing. Just as Tasha was about to call out to Ethan and suggest they head home, she saw a flash of blue lights. A siren sounded in the distance, and before she could even process what was happening, a police car rolled slowly up to the park entrance. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this at all. The woman's call to the police had brought them here. Tasha's throat tightened, and she felt her stomach drop. The police car came to a stop near the entrance, and a uniformed officer stepped out. He was a tall man with short cropped hair, looking around as if trying to find someone. His eyes scanned the park, and then settled on Tasha and Ethan. He started walking toward them, his footsteps loud on the gravel. Tasha's heart was pounding in her chest now, and she felt her pulse racing. Ethan had stopped swinging when he noticed the officer approaching. His innocent eyes looked up at Tasha, and she forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. The officer reached them and stopped a few feet away. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. "I've been asked to check in on a situation here. Is everything all right?" Tasha, though surprised by the officer's appearance, tried to stay composed. "Yes, everything's fine," she said, her voice steady, though a little shaky inside. "I'm just here with my son, enjoying the park." The officer looked at Tasha for a moment, his expression unreadable. He then glanced down at Ethan, who had clung to Tasha's side, sensing the shift in the air. Tasha could feel her body tense, unsure of what was going on. "Someone made a call about a potential issue here," the officer continued. "Just want to make sure everything's all right." Tasha's heart raced as she realized that the woman who had been watching them had called the police, probably to report something she had misunderstood. Tasha felt her throat tighten, and for a moment, she was unsure how to respond. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but the officer's presence made her feel exposed, as if she were being questioned for something she didn't even understand. "Is there a problem?" Tasha asked, her voice now more nervous than before. She knew she had nothing to hide, but the officer's presence made her uneasy. It was as if the situation was spiraling out of control for no reason at all. The park, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed like an unfamiliar place. The officer looked at Tasha again, his gaze softer now, as if realizing the misunderstanding. "I just need to confirm a few details, ma'am. Please bear with me," he said. Tasha nodded, trying to remain calm, even as her thoughts raced. What had just happened? What did the woman see that made her think something was wrong? Tasha's mind raced, but she could only hope that this would end quickly, that Ethan's innocent playtime wouldn't turn into something much more complicated. Tasha stood still, trying to process the situation as the officer stood in front of her, his attention flicking between her and Ethan. She felt a wave of frustration, her heart racing. Ethan, sensing the tension, had stopped holding onto the swing and was now standing quietly beside her, his small hand clutching her leg. Tasha could feel his nervousness through his touch, and it made her heart ache. She had no idea why the officer had come over, but one thing was clear: whatever had been reported was completely wrong. The officer's calm demeanor seemed to be working in his favor, but Tasha couldn't shake the tension building inside her. The moment felt surreal. She had walked through this park with Ethan countless times, and never once had she felt out of place. But today, everything was different. She could feel eyes on her, the weight of a misunderstanding hanging in the air. It was as though she had done something wrong simply by being there. Trying to keep her voice steady, Tasha spoke up. "I'm not sure what the issue is, officer. I'm just here with my son. We're not causing any problems." The officer nodded, still looking calm. "I understand. I'm just following up on a call that came in. Someone reported that there was a possible problem here, and it's my job to check it out. Nothing to worry about." Tasha gave him a tight smile, though inside she was seething. She couldn't help but feel like she was being treated like a criminal when all she wanted was a simple day at the park with her child. She had always known there were people out there who judged her because of the color of her skin, but this was different. The officer had no idea what was going through her mind, and as much as she tried to stay calm, her frustration kept growing. Ethan tugged gently at her sleeve, his soft voice breaking through the tense silence. "Mom, why is the police here?" Tasha looked down at him, her heart softening. She knelt down to his level, trying to keep her emotions in check. "It's okay, sweetie. We're just talking to the officer. There's nothing to worry about." The officer glanced at Ethan, his gaze softening for a moment. "Is this your son?" he asked, his tone much warmer than before. "Yes, he is," Tasha replied, her voice a little firmer now. She could feel her patience starting to wear thin, but she knew she had to remain composed. She wanted to end this as quickly as possible, to move on from whatever this confusion was. The officer nodded, and for a moment, there was an awkward silence between them. Tasha could hear the sounds of other families enjoying their day in the background. Children laughing, the gentle hum of conversation. But it all felt distant now. The park, once a place of peace, now felt like an interrogation room. Just then, the woman who had been watching them earlier reappeared, walking toward the officer with a confident stride. Tasha's stomach churned, and she couldn't help but feel the blood rush to her face. She recognized the woman instantly. It was the same person who had been eyeing them from afar. Her expression was a mix of satisfaction and uncertainty, as though she was waiting for the officer to take action. The officer turned to the woman, his expression neutral. "Is there something you'd like to add, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite, but no longer as friendly. The woman glanced at Tasha, then back at the officer, and for a moment, she seemed unsure of how to proceed. Tasha could feel the tension in the air thickening, but she held her ground. The officer's gaze moved back to her, and Tasha could see the wheels turning in his head. He had likely realized by now that nothing about the situation was as the woman had described. It was clear the woman had made a mistake, but Tasha wasn't sure how far this misunderstanding would go. With a small sigh, the woman spoke up. I just thought there was something wrong. I saw them walking together, and I thought." She paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "I thought the child might not belong to her." Tasha's face flushed with anger, but she kept her voice steady. "He is my son. We've been together since he was a baby." The woman glanced between the officer and Tasha, her expression faltering. She seemed to realize, in that moment, the gravity of what she had done. But Tasha wasn't in the mood to give her a pass. The damage had already been done, and the confusion was still hanging in the air. The officer took a deep breath and looked back at Tasha. "Thank you for your patience, Mom," he said, his tone softer now. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding. Everything's fine." Tasha nodded, her anger simmering beneath the surface, but she knew better than to engage any further. All she wanted was to get away from the situation. She gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, her fingers trembling slightly, and gave him a reassuring smile. As the officer turned to speak with the woman again, Tasha stood still, her fingers still lightly resting on Ethan's shoulder as she watched the woman, now visibly uncomfortable, speak with the officer. The words were hard to hear from where she stood, but Tasha could guess what was being said. The woman's face had gone from confident to apologetic, her posture shifting as if she were suddenly aware of how wrong her actions had been. She had clearly realized that her suspicion was unfounded, but the damage was already done. Tasha wanted to say something, to confront the woman and express how hurtful this whole experience had been, but she held herself back. It wasn't because she didn't feel angry. It was because she didn't want to give the woman the satisfaction of seeing her upset. Instead, she focused on Ethan, who was standing by her side, looking more confused than anything else. He hadn't fully grasped what had just happened, but the shift in the air was enough to make him feel uneasy. As the officer spoke to the woman, Tasha could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had stayed calm up until now, but every word, every action from the woman, made it harder to keep her composure. She tried to focus on her son, bending down slightly to meet his eyes. "It's okay, sweetie. The police are just making sure everything is all right." Ethan nodded, his small brow furrowed in thought. "Are they going to take us away?" he asked innocently, his voice trembling just a little. Tasha's heart broke at the question. She couldn't imagine how scary this must feel for him. She hugged him close, trying to offer him the comfort she so desperately needed for herself. "No, honey, they're not going to take us anywhere. We're just fine." The officer turned back to Tasha and Ethan, his expression more understanding now. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience," he said, his voice soft. "There was a call made about the situation, but it looks like there was a misunderstanding. Everything seems perfectly fine here." Tasha took a deep breath, holding back the flood of emotions that were threatening to overwhelm her. She didn't know if she could ever truly explain how deeply this hurt her. The officer's apology, though appreciated, didn't erase the discomfort of the situation. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, being questioned for something that wasn't even her fault. The woman, still standing a little apart from them, now seemed like she was shrinking under the weight of her own mistake. She was no longer looking at Tasha. Instead, she was staring at the ground, her hands wringing together nervously. Tasha could see the woman's regret in her body language, but it felt hollow. The apology that would have meant something, something that could have made this experience feel better, was never going to come. She could sense that the woman was uncomfortable, maybe even embarrassed, but it wasn't enough to erase the sting of what had just happened. The officer cleared his throat before turning back to Tasha, his face still calm. "Again, I'm sorry for the confusion. I'll make sure everything is cleared up." He then nodded to the woman, who mumbled something indistinct before turning and walking away. She didn't look back, and Tasha couldn't decide whether to feel satisfied or just relieved that it was finally over. As the woman disappeared from view, Tasha took a moment to exhale deeply. It was finally done. The officer was still standing there, but Tasha didn't feel the need to continue the conversation. She gave him a polite smile and nodded. "Thank you for your help," she said, though she didn't quite feel the gratitude that her words suggested. The officer, seeming to understand, gave a small nod of his own. "You're welcome, ma'am. Take care." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Tasha and Ethan alone in the park. Tasha watched the officer go, feeling a strange sense of exhaustion washing over her. It had only been a few minutes, but it felt like hours had passed. She wanted nothing more than to leave this place, to take Ethan and walk home where they could feel safe, away from all of this unnecessary chaos. Ethan, still holding her hand, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mom, are we going home now?" Tasha smiled softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from his face. "Yeah, sweetie, we're going home." And as they walked away from the scene, Tasha couldn't help but wonder how many other mothers, how many other families, had experienced something similar. How many times had people been judged, misunderstood, simply because of who they were? It was a question that lingered in her mind as they left the park behind, one that would stay with her long after this day was over. As Tasha and Ethan made their way out of the park, the weight of the situation still hung heavily in the air. She had kept her composure through the entire ordeal, but now that they were away from the officer and the woman, her mind was racing. How had things gotten so out of hand? Why did this happen? The confusion, the frustration, and the unfairness of it all were hard to shake off. She had done nothing wrong, but the events of the day had made her feel like she was somehow being punished for simply existing in a space with her child. Ethan was quieter now, his small hand clasped tightly in hers as they walked. He wasn't quite sure what had just happened, but he could sense the change in his mother's mood. Tasha could feel the tension in his grip, the unspoken questions in his gaze. He was only 5, but children could always tell when something wasn't right, when the world wasn't as simple as it seemed. "Mom," Ethan asked, his voice soft, "why was the police here?" Tasha took a deep breath. She had hoped to shield him from the worst of it, but she knew that he deserved an honest answer. It wasn't right to hide things from him, especially when he was growing up in a world that sometimes misunderstood their family. "There was a mistake, sweetie," she explained gently, her voice steady despite the flood of emotions inside. "Someone thought something was wrong, but it wasn't. The police just wanted to make sure we were okay. And we are. We're fine." Ethan didn't seem entirely satisfied with the answer, but he nodded anyway. "Okay, Mom." He squeezed her hand as they walked, the small gesture giving Tasha a small sense of comfort in the midst of everything. They continued down the path toward their home, each step taking them further from the tense moment in the park. But Tasha couldn't stop thinking about it. The woman's gaze, the officer's questions, it all felt like a stark reminder of how easily people made judgments based on what they saw. Tasha had always known that their family might not fit the mold that others expected, but moments like this still hit her harder than she was prepared for. It was one thing to know that prejudice existed, but it was another to be confronted with it in such an abrupt, painful way. The more Tasha thought about it, the more she realized that the woman's actions weren't just about her. They weren't just about a mother and child in a park. They were about something deeper, about assumptions, biases, and the way people often saw what they expected, not what was real. It wasn't the first time Tasha had felt the sting of being judged, but it was the first time she had ever felt so helpless in the face of it. As they walked, Tasha tried to focus on the positive. She had Ethan beside her, healthy and safe, and that was the most important thing. The world might not always understand them, but they understood each other. That was all that mattered. And she would do everything in her power to protect that bond, to shield him from the ugliness of the world that sometimes seemed so determined to create divisions where there should be none. "I'm sorry you had to see that, Ethan," she said quietly, her voice full of sincerity. People sometimes make mistakes, and sometimes they don't understand things. But I want you to know that nothing will ever change how much I love you, okay? Ethan looked up at her, his innocent eyes filled with trust and understanding. I know, Mom. I love you too. Her heart swelled with love for him, and for a moment, the weight of the situation seemed to lift. This little boy, this wonderful child, was the one person in the world who would never judge her, who would never question their bond. He was her reminder that love was stronger than all the misunderstandings and prejudices that the world could throw at them. As they continued their walk home, Tasha felt a renewed sense of determination. She would not let this incident define their day or their lives. She would keep moving forward, for herself and for Ethan. The world might sometimes make mistakes, but she knew who she was, and she knew who Ethan was. And nothing, not even this painful experience, could change that. They reached their home, and Tasha let out a small sigh of relief. As they walked through the door, she could already feel the comfort of their safe space. It was a reminder that no matter what happened out there, they were together, and that was all that mattered. She didn't need anyone else's approval to know that their love was real and strong. The door clicked shut behind them, and Tasha felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her as she and Ethan stepped inside their home. The comfort of the familiar surroundings wrapped around them like a warm blanket. It was their sanctuary, a place where they could just be themselves, away from the judgment and assumptions of the outside world. She let out a deep sigh, the weight of the day's events slowly starting to lift. Ethan, still holding her hand, glanced up at her with wide, thoughtful eyes. "Are we okay now, Mom?" he asked, his voice soft with uncertainty. It was a question that tugged at Tasha's heart. She had tried to shield him from the worst of it, but he was a smart little boy. He could sense when something wasn't quite right. Tasha crouched down to his level, her eyes meeting his. "Yes, sweetie. We're okay now. Nothing to worry about," she said with as much reassurance as she could muster. She gently cupped his cheek, offering him a warm, comforting smile. "I just want you to know that I'm always here for you, and I'll always protect you." Ethan nodded, though his brow furrowed slightly, as if he still wasn't entirely sure. He wrapped his arms around her in a tight hug, a small gesture that made Tasha's heart ache. She held him close, letting the moment linger for a while, savoring the peace that came from simply being in each other's presence. The world outside might have been filled with confusion and misunderstanding, but here, in this small corner of it, they had each other. After a few moments, Tasha stood up and straightened herself, taking a deep breath. She walked over to the window and looked outside, her thoughts swirling. The sky was beginning to turn a soft shade of orange as the sun started to set, casting a warm glow across the neighborhood. It should have been a calming sight, but all she could think about was what had just happened in the park. The woman's suspicious gaze, the police, the uncomfortable conversation. It all replayed in her mind like a broken record. But as much as she wanted to dwell on the injustice of it all, she knew that wasn't the path she wanted to take. She had to move forward, for herself and for Ethan. She wouldn't let this moment define them, wouldn't let it take away the peace they had worked so hard to build. Instead, she focused on the things that truly mattered: her family, their bond, and the love they shared. No amount of judgment from others could take that away. Ethan tugged at her sleeve, pulling her from her thoughts. "Can we have dinner now, Mom?" he asked, his voice eager, his innocent smile lighting up his face. Tasha chuckled softly, her heart swelling with affection. "Of course, sweetie. Let's get something to eat." They moved into the kitchen together, the small, familiar act of preparing a meal a grounding experience for Tasha. As she began chopping vegetables, Ethan climbed up onto one of the stools at the counter, chattering away about his day at the park. His words were a comforting distraction, a reminder that no matter what had happened, life would go on. There would be other days, other moments, and she would make sure that they were filled with happiness, love, and joy. As they sat down to eat, Tasha looked across the table at Ethan, his face lighting up with excitement as he dug into his meal. She smiled softly to herself. The world outside could be full of challenges, full of misunderstandings, but as long as they had each other, they could face anything. The bond they shared was stronger than any prejudice, stronger than any unfair judgment. And for the rest of the evening, as they enjoyed their meal together, Tasha allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt all day. Peace. It wasn't the peace that came from avoiding conflict or from hiding away from the world. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing who they were and knowing that nothing, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable, could change that. They would continue to love each other, to protect each other, and to live their lives with dignity, no matter what anyone else might think. That was the lesson Tasha wanted Ethan to carry with him, the lesson she would always remind him of as he grew older. No one's judgment could ever define them. Only love could do that. And as long as they had that, they would always be okay. The evening stretched on peacefully, the quiet rhythm of life slowly returning to normal as Tasha and Ethan settled into their routine at home. After dinner, Ethan had begged her to read one of his favorite books before bed, a request Tasha never turned down. The small, simple acts of their day, eating dinner, reading stories, and tucking him into bed, were moments she cherished. They were the antidote to the anxiety and stress she had felt earlier. As she read the story aloud, Ethan's eyes fluttered with sleep, and his little head rested against her shoulder. Tasha smiled softly, her heart full of warmth. This was the world she wanted to protect, the world she wanted to build for Ethan. A world where love and kindness ruled, not the misunderstandings and biases that sometimes shadowed their lives. She finished reading the story, placing a gentle kiss on his forehead before tucking the blanket around him. She sat by his bedside for a few moments, just watching him sleep. Ethan's peaceful face, relaxed and content, filled her with a sense of purpose. She knew that she was doing the right thing by protecting him, by showing him what it meant to stand strong in the face of adversity. He was growing up in a world that didn't always understand him, but she would always be there to guide him, to teach him the importance of compassion and understanding. As Tasha stood up to leave the room, she glanced out the window. The night was still, the sky darkened with the quiet hum of the evening. The stars twinkled overhead, offering their timeless reminder of the vastness of the universe. Tasha took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world's expectations and judgments lift just a little. She had made it through another difficult moment, and she knew there would be more to come. But she was ready. She would always be ready to face whatever came next, because she had something stronger than anything the world could throw at her. Her family, her love, and her unwavering determination to protect Ethan from the hurt that existed out there. The memory of the woman in the park still lingered in the back of her mind, but Tasha had learned something important from it. Sometimes people acted out of fear or ignorance, but that didn't mean their actions had to define the course of her life. The misunderstanding in the park had been a painful reminder of how easily people could jump to conclusions based on nothing but assumptions, but it also reaffirmed her belief in what really mattered: love, understanding, and the bond between a mother and her child were far stronger than any prejudice. She had experienced a moment of discomfort, but it had only served to reinforce her commitment to protecting her son, to ensuring that he grew up knowing who he was, regardless of what others might think. Tasha walked through the house, turning off lights and checking that everything was in order before she settled into her own bed. She was tired, but it was the kind of tired that came from a day well lived, a day spent with the ones she loved, despite the challenges. As she lay in bed, she thought about the future, about the lessons she would continue to teach Ethan, about the love they shared that nothing could ever take away. In the end, she knew that their journey was just beginning. The world was not always kind, and there would be moments when they would face difficulties that seemed insurmountable. But Tasha was confident that they would always be okay. Together, they could handle anything. She closed her eyes, feeling the steady rise and fall of her own breath, and let the quiet comfort of their home wash over her. Tomorrow was a new day, and no matter what it brought, She would face it with strength, courage, and an unshakable love for the child who made everything worthwhile. As she drifted off to sleep, she held on to one simple thought. Love was all they needed, and as long as they had that, nothing else mattered.